Shakespeare's sonnet number 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So you'll notice that I broke this poem down into a kind of unusual format, or perhaps a format you've never seen before, even if you've read Shakespeare's sonnets before. So the lines of the poem you'll see I've broken down. One, two, three, all of these numbers represent how many lines there are in the poem, and you can see that it is 14 lines altogether. And you'll also notice these letters next to these numbers. Each of these letters represent the rhyme scheme for the poem. So the first line ends with the word day, the second line ends with the sound eight, the third line ends with the word may, the fourth line ends with the word date. And so if this day is an A rhyme, then that A rhyme is repeated in line 3. If this is a B rhyme, then that B rhyme is repeated in line 4. So the rhyme scheme of the poem is A, B, and then a new rhyme begins, which is the shines, which is a C rhyme, and then dimmed is a D rhyme, and then declines is another C rhyme. And so we continue. A, B, C, D, E, F, and lastly G. And so you'll notice that because the poem is broken down in this way into basic units, right? The first 4 lines, 1 unit or 1 quatrain, 1, 2, 3, 4, quatrain. The next 4 lines, a unit unto itself, and we know it's a unit because just this quatrain just has C and D rhymes. So we have a second quatrain, and then the third unit just has E and F rhymes. And then the last 2 lines are not a quatrain, but there's just 2 lines, both of which rhyme with one another, and this is called a couplet. They have G rhymes. So any poem of this variety, right, this is called a Shakespearean sonnet. Now, there were other poets who wrote sonnets as well. There was a man named Spenser and another man named Sidney who wrote sonnets, but Shakespeare's sonnet takes this form of this particular rhyme scheme, 3 quatrains and 2 couplets in this particular rhyme scheme. Now, I'd like you to recognize that there's a difference between rhyme scheme and rhythm scheme. So rhyme is how every line ends, the sound at the end of every rhyme. Now, that's opposed to rhythm. Now, rhythm is, if you know anything about music, you know that rhythm is beats, and in this case, beats per line. And so remember, a beat is whether a line is stressed syllables or unstressed syllables, or combinations of the two, right? And every Shakespeare line has a combination of stressed and unstressed syllables. And so what I've done is I've noted how many stressed and unstressed syllables are, and you'll notice I've put a U above every syllable that's unstressed and an S above every syllable that's stressed. And you'll notice that as you read Shakespeare's poem aloud, you'll notice that the pattern that Shakespeare uses is a very, very regular pattern of unstressed followed by stressed, unstressed followed by stress, unstressed followed by stress. And so every rhyme, every line has this breaking down of words, and sometimes halves of words, into syllables. And so every line contains 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 beats, 5 beats per line, because every line, first of all, contains 10 syllables, and the syllables are broken down into unstressed followed by stressed. So shall I is emphasized. Compare, the pair in compare is the stressed syllable. You would not say compare, you would say compare, right? The natural stress falls on this syllable. The two, this is unstressed, this is stressed. Some of the word summer is divided into two syllables. The first syllable is the one that's stressed, right? We say summer, we don't say summer, right? And so therefore, the sum is stressed, the mer is unstressed. And day is the last syllable, and that is stressed. So it sounds basically like this: shall I compare the two summer's day, right? And because it's 5 beats per line, every beat is called a meter, and a 5-beat line is called a pentameter, right? And because these beats are organized as unstressed first, followed by stressed, this particular order is called an iamb. And so the rhythmic quality of the line, when you combine this iamb, which is unstressed, followed by stressed, and you combine the fact that there are 5 of them per line, this is where we get the word iambic pentameter. Shakespeare writes all of his lines in iambic pentameter, 5 beats per line of unstressed followed by stressed syllables. Okay, so that's just basic understanding of the rhyme and rhythm scheme. And you will be quizzed about this, so I hope you're paying attention. If you have any questions, I hope that you'll ask them. And the subsequent sonnets that I'll be lecturing on, I'll ask you to do some exercises identifying rhyme and rhythm schemes. But in any case, let's begin here with the interpretation. Because everything is broken down into units, we'll take it quatrain by quatrain. So in the first quatrain, you'll notice that certain things come out, certain words are repeated, and certain thematic images are repeated. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. And so one of the things you'll notice is repeated in the first quatrain is this word summer. It's repeated from line 1 to line 4. And so we know that the first quatrain is interested in this idea of summer, and not just all of summer, but a summer's day, right? And the poem begins with a question. Right? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? It's unusual to find a poem beginning with a question, because the next thing that we expect is, we're expected to give an answer, but instead Shakespeare gives us the answer to that question. Thou art more lovely and more temperate, right? And so in response to the question that he raises, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, he gives a response. You are more lovely and more temperate than a summer's day. And so the short answer to the question, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, is no. I probably shouldn't, right? Because you, in comparison to a summer's day, you're more lovely and more temperate. And so why would I compare you to something that's less nice than you? What else happens during a summer's day? Well, rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. And here, it's not just a day that's being talked about, right? But a month, right? And so time predominates throughout this first quatrain. First beginning with the measure of a day, then beginning with the measure of a month. And then in the fourth line, we see summer's lease, right? Summer's lease hath all too short a date. And so one of the things we can say dominates throughout that first quatrain is the idea of summer, and summer in its different measurements. The measure of a day, the measure of a month, and here the measure of a lease, right? A lease is a term, right? A lease can be for 3 months, for 4 months. How long does summer last? Well, it's different every year. Sometimes some summers are longer than others. And so here, the author asks us to consider, do you, the person to whom the poem is addressed, do you want to be compared to a summer's day? And then the answer is given, probably not. Probably you don't want that, right? Because you're more lovely and more temperate. And also, besides, look at what else happens during this span of summer, right? So, rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. And so You don't want to be compared because not only are you more lovely, more temperate, but you don't want to be compared to something that has rough winds in it. And you also don't want to be compared to something that has too short a date, right? Do you want to say that you're beautiful, but you're only beautiful for a short amount of time? You're nice and lovely, but you're only nice and lovely for a short amount of time? Is that the kind of comparison that you want? And so these images are continued. Some of these images of time are continued into the second quatrain, right? Second quatrain begins, some time too hot the eye of heaven shines, um, and and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair some time declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. And you can see how I've broken every syllable down. It just unstressed followed by stressed. There's a real metrical regularity over here. The idea of comparison and things in nature continue, right? Just as we began with natural things in the first quatrain, um, right? Some natural things that are mentioned is winds are natural things. Darling buds are things that appear in nature and associated with nature. And here, there are other things that are associated with nature that appear in the second quatrain. So there's a carryover. Here, the eye of heaven is mentioned. And of course, what is the eye of heaven? What is the eye of heaven that shines in the sky? That should be easy to figure out. The second line is a big clue. And often is his gold complexion dimmed. What is in the heavens that shines and has a gold complexion? Okay, you figured it out. The question is continued. Should I compare you to a summer day? Well, I shouldn't compare you for all the reasons mentioned in quatrain 1. And in quatrain 2, I shouldn't compare you to all the things that are present in nature and associated with summer, because sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines. Would you like to be compared to something that's too hot? Would you like it if someone said that you're beautiful but you're too hot-tempered? And often is his gold complexion dimmed. And so there's a contrast here in lines 5 and 6. Here, something is too hot. There is an intensity of the thing. And here in line 6, it's not hot enough, right? Here, it's too much of something, and here, dimmed suggests too little of something, or something that's being reduced as opposed to something that's being increased. So the eye of heaven shines at midday, it shines its brightest, but by dusk time, even that eye of heaven is dimmed. Do you want to be compared to something that rises and falls? Is that what kind of comparison you want? And every fair from fair sometime declines. And the word fair is repeated twice, right? So from fair, every fair sometime declines. If you have difficulty understanding what Shakespeare's lines mean, keep this in mind. Sentences are usually written in SVO format, right? When they're written in prose. First comes the subject, then comes the verb, then comes the object. But poetry doesn't obey these rules. Sometimes in poetry, you'll have the object come before the verb and the subject come at the end of the sentence. And so we have something like that over here. From fair, every fair, sometime declines, right? So think of it as from all fair things, every fair, from all fair things, every fair thing from among all fair things, sometime declines. And here's this word, sometime, right? Notice that repetition, just as we had repetition of summer's day in quatrain 1, in quatrain 2, we have a repetition of the word sometime, right? Sometime. Although you may be beautiful in May, although you may have beauty right now, sometime, there must be some time during which heat turns into coolness. There must be some time when what is beautiful, what is fair, declines from that fairness. There is always some time. Eventually, a time comes when beauty declines. And so if there are definitive moments, measures of time over here, a summer's day is a definitive moment of time. May is a definitive moment of time. Even a lease is definitive to the extent that, it might be 3 months, it might be 4 months, but there's a beginning and an end to it. Here, the definitive moment of time is instead turned into some time. It's much more vague. But in the vagueness, Shakespeare is suggesting that there will be eventually some time, no matter how beautiful or how fair you are, there will eventually be some time when there will be dimming, when there will be declining. Notice how these two words complement one another. And even by changing or by chance or nature's changing course, untrimmed. And So the only thing that never changes is nature's changing course, right? Nature will always have effect on all things, right? You will be affected. Either you'll be affected by nature or you'll be affected by chance. So the third quatrain begins with an important word, which is the word but. And anytime you've got these words like but or and or, these are important transition words. And keep your eye out for these transition words in Shakespeare's poems, right? Because these transition words are often words that suggest that something new is about to happen. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. And here he introduces a new idea, right? The but suggests that something different will happen. And he mentions the word summer again, but it's not the kind of summer that he mentioned in Quatrain 1. Here, it's not the summer that has a lease, but rather an eternal summer. Well, what does that mean? That seems almost paradoxical. Summer should have a beginning and an end, right? But here, he suggests something different, something paradoxical, and perhaps something even constructed, something artificial, something created. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. What's he mean by this? Nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Remember how the word fair was mentioned before, right? Here's the crossover from Quatrain 2 to Quatrain 3. Just as fair was mentioned here in Quatrain 2, and this fair is talking about every fair from fair sometime declines. Here, the word fair is used to suggest something different. Nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. So this word owest can be interpreted as ownest rather than owes, although it could be that as well, right? Your eternal summer will not lose possession of that fair which you own. Well, what kind of eternal summer wouldn't lose possession of fairness, even though in the previous lines he said every fair from fair sometime declines? What makes your fair different from the every fair mentioned in line 7? Let's keep reading. Nor shall death, capital D, brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. And this word when is as important for this quatrain as this word but is, because the when suggests under what conditions all these things will be true. So first of all, before we get to the when, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. This word shade, right, is interesting, right, because it creates a contrast. Contrast with what? Well, we talked about it earlier, right? The eye of heaven. So if things of nature are changeable, if things of nature cause fair to decline from fairness, right, and the eye of heaven is a thing of nature, here death is mentioned to point out the fact that death is also a thing of nature, right, and death is also something that takes away from beauty, right? If her beauty is compared to the eye of heaven, here death takes everything that is beautiful in the eye of heaven and takes it under his shade. Normally, that's what happens, right? We go from the sunlight of living to the shade of death. But here, the qualification is, nor shall death brag, thou wanderest in his shade. So what kind of eternal beauty would prevent even death from bragging that he's claimed this person? And here's where the qualification comes in. When in eternal lines to time thou growest. And so all these things, lines 9, 10, and 11, will happen when in eternal lines to time thou growest. And what could be meant? What could be meant by eternal lines? What are eternal lines? Well, keep this in mind. To some extent, every poem is about the writing of poetry. No matter what its subject matter, all poetry is self-reflexive. It reflects back on its own enterprise. And so we might think to ourselves, when in eternal lines to time thou growest, we might think of the eternal lines as perhaps being the lines that we're reading right now, the lines of poetry itself. Let's see if the couplet helps us with that, confirms that hypothesis. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this and this gives life to thee. And so, if our hypothesis is that these eternal lines perhaps have to do with poetry itself, these two lines at the end, these couplets, certainly reconfirm that, because as long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so eyes can see what? Well, if we're hypothesizing that eyes can see poetry, specifically these lines, right, in which she is memorialized, in which she's praised and extolled, as long as men can breathe, as long as there are human beings around still reading poetry, as long as there are still eyeballs on poems such as this, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So it's possible that she may die, right? She has a chronological date of birth and a chronological date of death. She may die, as in fact she has died. Whoever Shakespeare was writing this poem about is dead, long since dead. And yet there is a kind of eternity to her because she's been preserved in these lines that Shakespeare has written, right? The men of his time have seen her in these poems, and they've died. The men of times after him have breathed and seen her in these lines, and they've died individually. All the people who have beheld her have died, and yet the eternal lines in which she is preserved have not died. And so, to that extent, she remains alive. She remains alive because she is sort of kept in the amber of these eternal lines. So long lives this, and this gives life to thee. And so, this final line is very interesting, right? If all the previous quatrains have been talking about her, the first quatrain talks about her, the second quatrain talks about her, the third quatrain refers to thy eternal summer. It's still talking about her, but the third quatrain introduces this new idea, something that's not her, something that's external to her, right? These eternal lines, right, which are not her, but it's the poem about her. So we have a transition from quatrains 1 and 2 to the end of quatrain 3, and then quatrain 4 goes in a different direction altogether. It doesn't talk about her directly, but as a matter of fact, the only time that she's mentioned in the final couplet is in the last word, right? Every other word in the final couplet talks about men. And which men? The men who breathe, the men whose eyes see. And what are their eyes seeing? So long lives this. So she's still not mentioned. And this gives life to thee, right? And so it's the poetry, it's the eternal lines that's emphasized in the final couplet. And interestingly enough, it's her continued existence in these lines, right, that gives a kind of life to her that normal mortality cannot give, right? As they say, a subject is immortalized in the lines of poetry, and certainly these two couplets suggest that. There's also another interpretation as well that you may want to think about, and you may want to sort of play around with it in your mind. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. All along, we've been talking about this poem, or I've been talking about this poem, as if there's already someone there about whom the poem is written. Is that a fair assumption? Can we assume that there is an actual person about whom the poem is written? What if we don't assume that? What if we don't presume that? What if there is no one there about whom this poem is written? Is it possible that these last lines, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee, is it possible that these last beats, the last 3 feet of line 14, and I should mention that every one of these units is called a foot. So every line has got 5 feet. I should have mentioned this before, but I did not. So here's a foot, here's a foot. It's a unit of, it's a beat, right? It's a unit of rhythm. So every line has got 5 feet, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 beats per line, 5 feet per line. In the last 3 feet of the line, and this gives life to thee, there's this other idea that's raised, which is that perhaps there was no woman about whom this poem was written. Perhaps the woman or the person is actually created in the writing of the poem. There was no woman there to begin with, and the fact that now the poem has been written about a woman then creates in the reader's imagination a person. It creates in the reader's imagination a person. In other words, no poem, no person. Right? That's also a possible interpretation for these lines. So anyway, the next lecture will be a little bit shorter because I'm not going to talk so much about rhythm and rhyme, and we'll talk more in the same format of looking at the quatrains and couplets. So till next time.